My cousin Tyler raised his beer like he was toasting a war he'd never fought. "To Alex," he said, grinning at the whole backyard. "Our family's paper pilot." Laughter rolled across the patio, warm and easy, the kind that usually meant a summer evening was going well. Nobody looked at me. They didn't have to. Everyone already knew their version of me. The quiet cousin who flew a desk somewhere, who filed things, who smiled and nodded and never had much to say for herself. They didn't know the smell of jet fuel that stays in your hair for 2 days after a flight. They didn't know what it sounds like when a man's voice cracks over a radio because he's convinced himself no one's coming for him, and they definitely didn't know who Specter was. I smiled anyway. Silence had always been safer than the truth in this family. It was practically a house rule, right up there with never be late to Sunday dinner and don't talk about money. My name is Lieutenant Alexandra Reyes. Everyone calls me Alex. That backyard, that particular summer, was the last one I let anyone mistake my quiet for something small. I grew up in this house, 2 streets back from the Florida coast, in a family that ran on 3 unspoken rules: work hard, keep your head down, and never ever embarrass the Doyle name. My mother's brother, Frank Doyle, was the reason that name meant anything at all. Retired Navy commander, former SEAL platoon commander, a man who'd spent 30 years being the loudest kind of quiet, the kind that made whole rooms go still just from him walking into them. People in town still bought him drinks he never finished, just for the privilege of saying they had. Frank had a wall in his study covered in photographs nobody in the family was ever allowed to ask too many questions about. Grainy shots of younger men in gear, a few citations framed in dark wood. A folded flag under glass from a funeral he never talked about. Growing up, I used to sneak in there sometimes just to look at it, not because I understood any of it yet, but because it was the only room in that house that felt honest about what it cost to be the man everyone admired. His son Tyler had inherited all of the noise and none of the substance. Bigger arms every year, louder stories every summer, a gym membership he treated like an active deployment, and me, the niece who apparently flew a desk. I was the joke nobody bothered explaining because nobody thought there was anything worth explaining. I let them believe it. What I actually flew was classified enough that correcting the record would have raised more questions than I was cleared to answer at a family cookout with 3 generations of Doyle's eavesdropping over potato salad. Some nights, the real memory came back uninvited anyway, no matter how many years passed. The cockpit lit red, alarms threading through the roar of the rotors. A voice on the radio, ragged with a fear the man on the other end would never admit to out loud in daylight, were pinned down. "Specter, do you copy?" And my own voice, steadier than I actually felt, "Copy. I'm not leaving you." 3 years before that backyard in waters the Navy still won't name in any report I'm cleared to read, I flew an MH-60 Seahawk into weather no sane pilot chooses to fly into. To pull out a SEAL platoon that had been cut off from extraction for 6 hours after their planned pickup point turned out to be sitting in the open, exposed on 3 sides. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing. My co-pilot, a lieutenant junior grade named Osei who'd been flying with me for 8 months, kept saying my name over the intercom like a metronome, half checking on me, half checking that I hadn't lost my nerve. I hadn't. I'd lost something else that night. The easy ability to sleep without hearing rotor blades in my head. But not my nerve. I didn't know, that night, whose father I was carrying home in the back of that helicopter, half conscious, blood soaking through a field dressing on his shoulder. I found out weeks later, standing in my commanding officer's office at the air station, a cup of bad coffee going cold in my hand, when he said, almost like he didn't want to be the one telling me, "Commander Doyle owes you his men's lives, Lieutenant. He knows it was you out there." Commander Doyle, I repeated, like saying it slower might change what it meant. "Retired now," my CO said, sliding a redacted printout across the desk toward me without quite meeting my eyes, the way people do when they know they're handing you something heavier than paper. But yes, Frank Doyle, platoon commander on the ground that night. He put in a request through channels to have your name released to him personally for what it's worth. Request was denied. OPSEC on an op like that doesn't bend for family no matter who's asking. He knows it was me, I said again, still not quite landing on the right reaction, and he hasn't said anything. That's not really my business, and it's not really yours either, Lieutenant, not in any official capacity. He closed the folder. But since you'll probably run into the man again someday, given who your mother is, I figured you'd rather hear it from me than find out some other way." I remember the floor tilting a little, the way it does when a piece of information doesn't fit into the shape you'd built your understanding of the world around. Commander Frank Doyle, my uncle, the man whose approval Tyler had spent his whole childhood chasing like it was oxygen. He'd been there, on that beach, in that chaos. He'd heard my voice on the radio, close enough that he must have recognized it the second he was well enough to think straight. And he'd said nothing. Not to me. Not to anyone. Not for years. That night, back home for the weekend, restless in a way I couldn't shake, I found my father sitting alone on the porch, the particular quiet he only sank into after a long day at the plant. He didn't ask what was wrong, he just said, almost to himself, watching the palmettos sway in the dark, "Some people get applause, Alex. Others just get the sound of engines." It was his way of telling me he saw me, even when nobody else in that family bothered to look. I loved him for it, the way you love someone for handing you exactly the sentence you needed, without you having to ask for it. But the quiet didn't comfort me the way it used to. It sat on my chest that whole weekend like wet sand, heavier every time somebody at Sunday dinner asked Tyler about his new personal training clients and let my answer too. "So, how's work?" trail off after 4 words. If Frank wanted silence, I decided somewhere around midnight that night, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles above my childhood bed, then I'd learned to want the exact opposite. Not loud, not Tyler loud, just true. Out loud when it mattered. The moon was already high when I walked down to the water later that same trip, my boots leaving prints that filled in with sand behind me almost as fast as I made them. I wasn't surprised to find Frank there, a beer sweating in his hand, eyes fixed on the horizon like the sea owed him an explanation for something. He didn't turn around when he heard me coming. "Thank you, Alex. I know you're a Specter." The words landed like a flare, bright, fast, gone almost as soon as they arrived. "I just did my job," I said quietly, coming to stand beside him, close enough to smell the salt on his jacket. "You could have said something, just once in 3 years." I didn't want Tyler to feel small next to me. "Then you made me smaller instead," I said, "every single summer." He didn't argue with that. He just nodded slowly, watching the water like it might change its mind about something if he waited long enough. "You're right," he admitted. "My whole platoon owes you their lives, and in this line of work, nobody says thank you out loud. We just remember. Quietly. Privately. Like it's shameful to say it, where somebody might actually hear it and think less of us for needing help." I studied his profile in the moonlight, a man who'd built an entire career and entire identity on command and control. On the old idea that saying your feelings out loud made you weak in front of the men who depended on you. He wasn't cruel. He'd just been built by an older logic, forged somewhere between Bud-S training and 30 years of deployments, where softness genuinely could get somebody killed. But that same order he protected so carefully, so instinctively, was quietly starving the people who loved him. Starving me. "Keep your silence if it helps you sleep at night, Frank," I told him, keeping my voice level even though my pulse wasn't. "But the next time somebody laughs at me across that table, I'm done giving you a pass to stay quiet right alongside them. I'm going to prove to you exactly what I mean by that, and you're going to have to decide eventually what you're willing to do about it." He looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that I hadn't seen there before. Not pride. Exactly. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. Like the first crack of light under a door that's been shut for a long time. "Fair," he said finally. "You've earned the right to say that to me." The tide pushed in closer, foam licking cold around our boots. I turned back toward the house, the laughter still faint behind me from whoever was left on the patio, and made myself a promise that finally had teeth in it. I wasn't going to wait for the world to catch up to who I was becoming. I was going to make it. I don't tell this part to anyone, not even now. But it's worth setting down once, plainly, because everything else in this story only makes sense if you understand what that night actually was, underneath the redactions and the careful language of an after-action report. We launched at 0140 local, weather already deteriorating faster than the forecast had promised it would. My co-pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade OC, had flown with me for 8 months by then, long enough that we'd stopped needing to say most things out loud in the cockpit. That night we said almost everything out loud anyway, because the situation demanded it. The platoon had been inserted 6 hours earlier for what was supposed to be a 2-hour reconnaissance window. Their extraction point turned out to be sitting in open ground exposed on 3 sides, and by the time anyone on the ground realized it, they were already pinned down under fire with no clean way out and a storm rolling in that was going to ground every other aircraft in the area within the hour. Specter, this is Overwatch, be advised. Primary LZ is compromised. Repeat, compromised. The voice on the radio belonged to a communications officer I never met in person, relaying coordinates through static that kept swallowing every third word. I remember Osei's hand tightening on the collective beside me, not from fear exactly, more like the particular focus that shows up right before your body decides whether it's going to be useful or not. We're not cleared for that ceiling, he said, meaning the weather, meaning the visibility dropping toward nothing, meaning every rule either of us had ever been taught about when a sane pilot turns back. I know, I said. We're going anyway. The flight in was the kind of flying you don't really remember afterwards so much as feel in your hands for weeks, instruments only rain hammering the windscreen sideways. The altimeter, the only thing I trusted more than my own eyes. Somewhere below us, 7 men were flattened against wet sand behind whatever cover they could find, and one of them, a man I wouldn't meet properly for another 3 years, was screaming coordinates into a radio with a voice that had already accepted on some level that help might not actually come. We're pinned down. Specter, do you copy? Copy. I'm not leaving you. I brought the aircraft down into a landing zone I could barely see, close enough that the rotor wash sent sand and seawater sheeting sideways across men who were already soaked through. Loading 7 wounded and exhausted operators into the back of a Seahawk in the dark, under fire, in a crosswind that kept trying to weather vane the whole aircraft sideways is not something that translates cleanly into words afterward. It's something your hands remember and your mouth mostly can't describe. We got everyone out. That's the part that matters. The rest of it, the redacted lines in the report, the classified designation on the operation, the reasons nobody was allowed to say my name out loud for 3 years afterward, all of that came later, built on top of 6 minutes on the ground that I still dream about some years more than others. I didn't know lifting off that beach with a cabin full of wounded men and the storm closing in behind us, that one of the men bleeding through a field dressing in the back would spend the next 3 years unable to say my name at his own family's dinner table. That part of the story hadn't been written yet. That part, it turned out, was going to take much longer to land than the helicopter did. 2 years passed, the way years actually do, when you're building a career instead of just watching a calendar. I made full lieutenant, transferred to a new squadron, logged hours I still wasn't cleared to talk about over dinner, and came home for the 4th of July as a slightly different version of myself, one who fit differently into her own family's backyard the way a key that's been recut fits a lock that used to stick. Tyler had a wife now, Brianna, quiet and watchful in a way that made me suspect she saw more of the family's dynamics than she ever let on, and a baby boy, Caleb 3 months old, asleep in a bassinet parked in the shade by the cooler while his father held court by the grill, exactly the way his own father had before him, spatula raised like a scepter. "Welcome home, Lieutenant Reyes," Tyler called out when he spotted me getting out of my car, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "Heard the Navy's keeping you real busy with paperwork and PowerPoints these days." The laughter that followed hit like static crackling over a bad radio connection. I let it play itself out completely before I answered, calm and even, setting my bag down on the porch step. "Depends on the altitude." The yard went quiet in a way that had teeth of its own. Even the breeze off the water seemed to hold still for a beat. Frank looked up from his lawn chair, pride and warning crossing his face at almost the same instant, like he wasn't sure which reaction he was allowed to reach for in front of everyone. Nobody asked me anything else that evening. I ended up on the porch steps beside my mother Carol, who topped off her lemonade and said in the gentle, glancing way she always talked about things that quietly made her nervous, "Tyler's doing so well with that new gym program of his. Your flying's nice too, honey." "Just so dangerous." I smiled, the kind of smile that cracks about halfway before it ever reaches your eyes, and let the comment drift out over the yard without correcting it. That was the night I decided that waiting for Frank to find his own courage on his own timeline wasn't a strategy anymore. It was just a slower version of staying silent myself. I found him 2 days later alone in his garage, sanding down an old fishing rod he clearly didn't need to sand. the way men of his generation invent small tasks to give their hands something to do while their minds work to something bigger. I didn't ease into it. I gave you 2 years, Frank, I said, leaning against the doorframe. You told me you'd figure out how to tell him. You haven't. He didn't look up from the rod. It's not that simple, Alex. It is actually. You just don't want it to be. I crossed my arms. So here's where we stand now. I'm not asking you anymore, and I'm not waiting on you either. By the time Caleb's old enough to remember these summers, really remember them, the way kids start to around 6 or 7, I want him growing up in a family where nobody has to get laughed at first before they're allowed a little respect. You have until then to find your spine on your own terms. If you don't, I'll find mine without your permission, and I won't be gentle about the timing of it. He set the sandpaper down slowly, deliberately, the way he probably once set down a rifle after a long op. For the first time since I'd known him as anything other than the family legend, Frank Doyle looked like a man who'd been handed an order he genuinely didn't know how to follow. You sound like your CO, he said, half a laugh caught somewhere in it, half something heavier. I learned from someone who never says thank you out loud, I said. Guess some of that rubbed off on me whether either of us wanted it to. He didn't answer, but I noticed, driving away that afternoon, that he was still standing in the garage doorway watching my car pull out, the sanded rod forgotten in his hand. The next barbecue that actually mattered came almost a year later, Memorial Day weekend. The whole extended family packed shoulder to shoulder into the backyard, coolers sweating in Florida heat that made even the shade feel optional. Frank's old teammate, Senior Chief Ray Alvarez, had flown in from San Diego for the weekend, a wiry, sun-cured man with a laugh that carried 3 yards further than he probably intended it to. The kind of visit that always turned into a night of old stories getting bigger with every retelling. I liked Ray immediately, the way you sometimes like people who clearly loved your relatives before you were old enough to understand what that love had cost them. He told stories about Frank as a young lieutenant that made my very serious uncle sound almost reckless, almost funny. A story about a training exercise gone sideways in cold water off Coronado. Another about a bar in Naples that neither of them was allowed back into, and for a couple of hours the whole yard seemed to loosen up around the two of them. Decades of friendship visible in the easy way they finished each other's sentences. Ray had retired 2 ranks below Frank, a senior chief petty officer to Frank's commander, but rank had never once seemed to sit between them the way it might have between other men. Best platoon commander I ever served under, Ray told the table at one point, raising his glass toward Frank, and the only one who ever actually listened when an enlisted man told him he was wrong. Frank waved him off, embarrassed in the particular way men like him got embarrassed by praise instead of criticism, but I noticed he didn't argue the point either. Ray had 2 beers in him and a grin that didn't yet know it was about to detonate something nobody at that table was braced for. He slapped Frank on the shoulder, easy and affectionate. Hey, remember that pilot who pulled your whole platoon out during the extraction that went sideways off the coast, back when everything went dark? Cap? What was her call sign again? Been driving me nuts for 3 years. I can never remember it. The air in the yard changed before anyone said another word. Frank hesitated, just a half-second too long, the kind of pause only somebody who'd spent 2 years watching him carefully would even catch, then forced a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Specter, he said. Hell of a pilot. He said it like a confession. Nobody else in that yard heard it that way. I did. Tyler, oblivious as ever, laughed into his drink from across the table. Man, must have been a real one. Some people fly and some people just push papers around a simulator. I set my drink down on the railing, slow and deliberate, the ice cube settling with a small clink that felt louder than it should have in that particular silence. Some of us fly where there's no do-over, Tyler. The word sat there in the middle of the yard, sharp enough that even the cicadas in the palmettos seemed to pause mid-song. I didn't wait around for a response. I got up and walked toward the water, and I could feel Frank's eyes following me the whole way across the grass. Heavy as the tide he loved so much to stare at whenever he had something he didn't want to say out loud. That night the sky over the water lit up early, somebody's private fireworks a few houses down, testing out the evening before the real 4th of July show a few days later. Tyler was still holding court near the grill when I finally came back up from the beach, his voice pitched for an audience the way it always was. Hey, Alex, he called out, grinning, clearly having decided the earlier moment had blown over. Maybe next summer you'll join us for some real military training. Could be good for you." The laugh that followed was smaller this time, more reflex than genuine heat, but it still landed somewhere it shouldn't have. Caleb, walking confidently now at almost 2, wobbled over holding his mother's hand, looking up at his father with the open, unguarded curiosity only a toddler still has, before anyone's taught them what they're supposed to find embarrassing. "Dada," he said, pointing a chubby finger straight at me. "Anti-fly too?" The yard actually went quiet for that one, in a way it hadn't for anything Frank or I had said all night. Tyler forced a chuckle, glancing around like he was checking whether anyone had noticed his son's unfortunate timing. "Not that kind of flying, buddy." I crouched down to Caleb's height, the way you do for someone who hasn't learned yet what he's supposed to be embarrassed about on other people's behalf. "Maybe one day you'll understand what kind really means," I told him, quiet enough that it was just for him. He nodded, wide-eyed, solemn in the particular way small children get solemn, like I'd just handed him a secret worth keeping. That kind of unfiltered honesty from a 2-year-old hit harder, honestly, than any joke Tyler had aimed at me in 3 summers combined. Later, after the crowd had thinned out and the test fireworks down the beach had burned themselves out into smoke, I found Frank alone at the kitchen table, a half-empty beer sweating a ring into the wood grain, his hand not quite steady around it in a way I'd never seen from him before. "You heard Ray earlier," he said, not looking up when I sat down across from him. "I heard you," I said. "That's different." He finally lifted his eyes to mine, and for the first time in the 3 years I'd known this particular version of him, I saw something in his face that wasn't pride, wasn't command, wasn't even guilt exactly. It was closer to fear. "There's more to it than just the rescue, Alex," he said quietly, turning the beer can in a slow ring of condensation on the table. "Something I've never told anyone, not even Ray, and Ray was 10 feet away from me that whole night." I sat with that for a second, then leaned forward. "Then tell me. Now, not another 2 years from now." He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer at all. "Then, the reason we were pinned down that night, the reason you had to fly into weather no sane pilot would ever touch on purpose, wasn't bad luck, and it wasn't the enemy being smarter than us. It was me. I called the wrong extraction point. Intel gave me 2 options, and I picked the one that made me look decisive in front of my own men instead of the one that was actually safer, because I didn't want to look uncertain 12 hours into an op. My pride put my entire platoon into that position. Your flying got us out of a hole I dug with my own hands." His voice cracked hard on the last few words, and he pressed his palm flat against the table like he needed something solid to hold onto. "Every single time somebody says your name, Alex, I have to remember that I almost got 7 men killed because I cared more about how I looked than what was actually true. So I stopped letting people say your name. It was easier than remembering." I sat with that for a long moment, the refrigerator humming in the quiet kitchen, the distant pop of somebody's leftover fireworks drifting through the screen door. It wasn't the confession I'd braced myself for, not simple vanity protecting Tyler's ego, but something heavier, older, a wound Frank had apparently been carrying alone in total silence for 3 years. "That's not a reason to erase me, Frank," I said finally, gently, reaching across the table without quite touching his hand. "That's a reason to finally tell the whole truth. Both halves of it." "I know," he said. "I've known for a long time now. I just didn't know how to say the good part without the other part following it out of my mouth, right behind it." "Then say both parts," I told him. "That's what honor actually costs, in the end. Not just the easy half where you're the hero, the whole thing." He didn't answer me, but something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly, like a rope that had finally been given some slack after being pulled taut for years. The 4th of July that year carried its own kind of heat before the fireworks even started. Tyler was mid-story near the grill showing off some new training routine to a small admiring cluster of cousins when Ray, 3 beers deep again, feeling generous with old memories the way he always did by this point in an evening, leaned toward Frank with a grin, not knowing he was about to light a fuse that had been sitting there patiently for a year. "You ever actually tell your boy the whole story about Specter, Frank? Whole thing, not the short version?" The yard's noise dropped to a murmur around them. Tyler blinked, half laughing, not yet understanding why the question mattered as much as it clearly did to the 2 men standing near him. "What story?" Frank stood up slowly. I watched him do it, watched 30 years of command posture settle back into his spine like it had never actually left. Just been folded up and set aside for a while. Tyler, he said, voice carrying without needing volume. The particular tone that used to move entire platoons without a single raised word. Apologize. Now. Tyler's grin faltered, uncertain. Dad, it's just a joke. Apologize for what? For mocking the pilot who flew through weather that night that grounded 2 Blackhawks the same evening to pull my platoon out of a position I put us in myself. Frank's voice didn't rise, but it cut through every murmured conversation in that yard like a blade through warm butter. You mean her, he said, nodding toward me, and every head at that table turned to follow the gesture. She flew through fire so I could come home and raise you, and for 3 straight summers you've laughed at her. You didn't ask a single question. None of you ever asked. The color drained clean out of Tyler's face. Brianna, beside him, went very still, one hand coming to rest protectively on Caleb's shoulder where he stood watching, confused, sensing the shift in the air the way small kids always do. I didn't know, Tyler said. I stood there in the quiet that followed, the kind of silence that actually hums with everything that's finally getting said out loud after years of not being. Tyler looked over at me, something visibly breaking open behind his eyes, not performance this time, not the practiced charm he usually led with. I'm sorry, he said, and for once it genuinely didn't sound like a lie. It's fine, I said, though we both understood it wasn't entirely, not yet, not after 3 summers of it. Frank crossed the yard and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a brass challenge coin, its edges already worn soft from years of being turned over privately in someone's hand, and pressed it into my palm with both of his hands wrapped briefly around mine. To the one who flew through it, he said, loud enough for the whole silent yard to hear this time. You earned this years ago. I should have given it to you in front of everyone then, not just to your face alone on some empty beach where nobody else could see me finally do it right. The fireworks started up somewhere over the water a few minutes later, their noise almost swallowed whole by how quiet that backyard had gone. I drove home along the coast that night with the windows cracked, the smell of salt and gunpowder trailing in behind me on the warm air. The coin sat in the cup holder, catching headlights every time another car passed, flashing gold and gone, gold and gone. I didn't feel angry, which surprised me a little. I felt something closer to clean, like a splinter that had finally worked its own way out after years of low background ache. Frank's truck pulled up behind mine when I stopped at the overlook a few miles down, the one where the road curves close enough to the water that people park just to watch the tide for a while. He got out slower than he used to. Not the commander tonight, just a man in a wrinkled shirt walking toward the water with his hands in his pockets. You shouldn't have had to wait this long for me to say all of it, he said, coming to stand beside me at the railing. No, I agreed, but you did, eventually. That still counts for something. He handed me a folded page, a partial after-action report, most of it still blacked out in thick official lines of redaction, but my call sign Specter still visible right where the censor's marker had stopped short. Like even the redaction hadn't been able to bring itself to erase that part. They classify almost everything that actually matters, he said, but nobody who was there ever forgets a call sign. Not the men who you're alive because of it. He took a slow breath, and for the first time in my life, I watched Frank Doyle's eyes go visibly glassy in front of another person. I thought staying quiet was protecting you, he said. I was wrong about that. It was protecting my own guilt, and Tyler's ego, right alongside it. 2 birds, 1 very cowardly stone. Yeah, I said quietly. Him too. He pulled a second coin from his other pocket. Older, more worn than the first, the edges gone almost smooth. This one's from the whole platoon, not just me. We've been carrying it around for 3 years, waiting for a day we'd actually have the guts to hand it over instead of just talking about doing it. I held both coins in my open palm, the metal catching what little moonlight made it through the clouds. We're square, Commander, I said. Just don't go quiet on me again. I mean that. He nodded out toward the tide, watching it the way he always did when he had something he wasn't sure he was allowed to say. No more silence, he said. Then, quieter, almost like he wasn't certain he should say it at all. Tyler's not really angry at you, you know. Not deep down. He's angry at himself for never having earned anything the way you did, the hard way, without anybody handing it to him first. Then maybe it's time he learns how to, I said. The wind shifted, cool and steady off the water. I closed my hand around both coins and let the tide carry the last of the night's noise out to sea. One wave at a time, 2 years after that overlook conversation, I stood on the tarmac at Naval Air Station, Pensacola. Sunlight flashing hard off rows of dress whites and polished brass, the band running through warm-up scales somewhere behind the risers. I'd been summoned back for a Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal ceremony for actions during the extraction finally declassified enough to be spoken about in daylight, now in front of cameras. In front of actual people instead of just a folder with my name blacked out of it. The hangar doors stood open to the runway. I scanned the crowd out of old habit the same way I scanned any open space before I could stop myself, and froze when I found Frank near the back, dressed in his old uniform, ribbons, faded but present. Shoulders squared the exact way they'd been the night he made Tyler apologize. He'd never once come to a ceremony for anyone, as far as I could remember. Not mine, not anyone else's in the family. For a second, the noise of the hangar seemed to fold in on itself around that single fact. A woman I didn't recognize stepped up to the podium before the applause had fully faded. Rear Admiral Diane Sorensen, according to the printed program, one of the relatively few female flag officers in naval aviation at the time. She read my name, my rank, Lieutenant Commander, now the promotion having come through 6 months earlier, and then paused before reading the citation itself, looking out over the crowd like she was deciding, right there in front of everyone, whether to go off script. "I've sat through more than a few of these ceremonies over the years," she said, "and more than a few backyard barbecues before that, where nobody thought to ask me how many flight hours I'd logged that particular month." It's a particular kind of quiet, being the answer to a question nobody bothers asking in the first place. Lieutenant Commander Reyes knows that quiet better than most people her age ever should have to. Today we're done letting it stand in for the truth. I felt something tighten hard in my throat that had nothing to do with the Florida humidity pressing in on everyone under that hangar roof. After the formal remarks, while the crowd mingled near the refreshment tables, Admiral Sorensen found me near the edge of the tarmac, away from most of the noise. "Off the record," she said, "how many summers did it take your family to catch up to the paperwork?" 3, I said, "give or take." She nodded like that number didn't surprise her at all. "Mine took considerably longer. My father still introduces me at church as my daughter who works for the Navy, like I'm answering phones somewhere." She shook her head, not quite bitter, more like someone who'd made peace with a long-running joke at her own expense. "It gets easier once you stop needing them to say it right. Doesn't mean it stops mattering when they finally do." When the applause faded, Frank walked toward me across the tarmac, an old worn seal cap in his hands instead of any hat of his own. "You made that uniform look better than any of us ever did," he said. "Don't exaggerate, Commander," I said, though the lump still sitting in my throat made the joke come out rougher than I meant it to. He straightened his back and, in front of the whole crowd, in front of cameras that would later put this exact moment on the local evening news, he saluted me. A few of the older SEAL veterans standing nearby followed his lead without needing to be asked, heads bowed slightly in that particular kind of respect that never needs words attached to it to mean something. I returned a salute, holding it a beat longer than regulation strictly required. Neither of us said anything else out loud. It was an acknowledgement 9 years in the making, and by that point it didn't need any decoration at all. After the ceremony wound down, Frank found me again by the hangar doors and handed me an old, sun-faded photograph, himself as a young lieutenant standing beside a pilot whose face the light had washed out almost completely in the print. "Never did get her name at the time," he murmured, half to himself, studying the photo like it might finally answer something. "Guess now I understand why that used to bother me more than it probably should have, all these years." That night, back at the hotel, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Tyler. "Saw the clip on the local news. Mom sent it to me. You deserved every second of that up there. Proud of you, cuz. For real this time. Short, honest. Enough." I looked at my own reflection in the dark phone screen for a long moment before I finally set it down, eyes stinging, not from pain this time, but from something a lot closer to peace than I'd expected to feel that night. Not long after the ceremony at Pensacola, a young ensign named Mara Chen got assigned to my squadron fresh out of flight school, the kind of nervous sharp that reminded me uncomfortably of myself a decade earlier. She found me in the ready room one afternoon, working up the nerve for something, the way junior officers do when they've rehearsed a question in the mirror and still aren't sure it's allowed. "Ma'am, can I ask you something not exactly official?" "You can ask," I said. "Doesn't mean I promise a useful answer. My family keeps asking when I'm going to get a real desk job, something safer." She said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. My dad especially. I don't know how to make him understand what I actually do without sounding like I'm bragging or like I'm asking for something from him. He doesn't know how to give. I thought about Frank standing frozen at a kitchen table, about my mother's careful, glancing sentences on the porch, about how many years it had taken one honest confession to undo 3 summers of silence. You don't make them understand, I told her. Not on your timeline anyway. You just keep flying well enough and keep telling the truth when somebody's finally ready to actually hear it. Sometimes that's your father. Sometimes it's an uncle. Sometimes it takes longer than you'd like, and that's not a reflection on whether what you're doing matters. That's not exactly comforting, ma'am. No, I agreed. But it's true, and I'd rather hand you true than comforting. You'll thank me for it eventually, probably at a family barbecue if my experience is anything to go by. She almost smiled at that, some of the tension easing out of her shoulders. I thought watching her go about Admiral Sorensen's voice at the podium. It's a particular kind of quiet being the answer to a question nobody bothers asking, and understood maybe for the first time all the way through, that the job wasn't just to stop being quiet myself, it was to make sure the next one down the line didn't have to wait 9 years for somebody else to finally ask the right question first. A year later, summer came back to the Doyle backyard, softer than I remembered it ever being able to be. No bravado carried across the grass this time. No story competing to be the loudest one at the table. Just the low crackle of the old grill, the rustle of palm leaves overhead, and Caleb 5 now, chasing his younger cousins around the yard with the kind of unself-conscious joy only kids that age still have full, unguarded access to. Tyler had changed in ways that weren't just performance for an audience anymore. He'd started volunteering with a local veterans outreach program the year before, helping guys coming back from deployment navigate the strange, heavy quiet of civilian life, the kind of quiet nobody warns you about until you're already living inside it. His voice carried something now it never used to have, less noise, more weight behind the words when he actually chose to use them. When I walked into the backyard that evening wearing a simple service uniform, no medals, no ribbons pinned on, just fabric and rank insignia, the conversation at the table paused on its own. Tyler stood up from his chair, smiling in a way that genuinely wasn't trying to impress anyone for once in his life. "Everyone," he said, raising his voice just enough to carry, "meet Lieutenant Commander Reyes, the pilot who brought my dad home to us." Applause rippled around the table, warm and completely unforced this time. Frank stayed quiet at the head of the table, his eyes shining as he watched me find a seat beside my mother. Carol leaned close, squeezing my hand under the table. "Finally," she whispered. "People know who you actually are." "That's not really why I came today, Mom," I told her, and I meant every word of it. Caleb came running over from the yard, breathless, trying his best to stand up straight the way he'd clearly seen soldiers do in movies. "Dad says you flew through storms to save people," he announced, like he was reporting a fact he was proud to have memorized correctly. I knelt down to his height. "I just didn't leave them behind," I said. That's really all any of it was. Something in that plain answer must have landed harder than I expected, because when I glanced up, Frank's composure had slipped, his shoulders shaking slightly, tears tracing quiet paths down a face that had spent 30 years training itself not to do that in front of other people. He pretended to be very interested in the label on his drink for a moment. Tyler put a trembling hand on my shoulder as he passed behind my chair. "I should have known better," he said quietly. "Just for me." A long time before I finally did. "Now you do," I said and smiled, not out of pride this time, but something closer to release. My father found me a few minutes later, easing himself down onto the porch step beside me with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees had started keeping their own opinions about stairs. He didn't say anything for a while, just watched the yard the way he always did, taking it in before he spoke. "Remember what I told you, out here, years back?" he said eventually. "About applause and engines?" "I remember. Wasn't sure you'd ever get both," he said. "Figured you'd have to pick. Glad I was wrong about that part." He reached over and squeezed my hand once, briefly, the way he'd always shown affection, economically, like a man rationing something precious. "Proud of you. Always was. Just glad the rest of them finally caught up enough to say it too." I found Rihanna a little later, alone by the cooler, watching Caleb chase fireflies at the edge of the yard where the grass gave way to dune grass. "He talks about you constantly, you know," she said, not looking away from her son. Not the war hero version. The version where you knelt down and actually answered his question instead of brushing him off like everyone else always did. I didn't do much, I said, just told him the truth. That's the part nobody in this family was doing for a long time. She finally looked over at me, something careful and honest in her expression. I used to sit at these dinners and watch you get talked over, and I never said anything either. I told myself it wasn't my place, marrying into all this. I'm not proud of that. I just wanted you to know, I noticed, even when I didn't say it. You're saying it now, I said. That's not nothing. She smiled, a little sad around the edges. Tyler married me because I don't make noise for the sake of it. Took me a long time to realize that's not the same thing as staying quiet about what actually matters. Later, as the sky turned gold over the water, Frank found me alone by the porch rail. He held out the old worn seal coin, the very first one, its edges softened smooth from years of being turned over privately in his pocket, worried like a rosary bead. This belongs with you, he said. Always did, even when I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. I looked over at Caleb, popsicle sticky fingers wrapped around the porch railing, watching intently the way the last light caught the coin's brass edge. Keep it here, actually, I told Frank. Let him see it every single day. Let him grow up already knowing what it means, instead of having to learn it the slow, hard way like the rest of us did. Frank nodded, closing his hand around the coin for a long moment before crouching down carefully, his knees not quite what they used to be, and placing it gently into Caleb's small open palm. The sunset caught the brass and threw a little shard of light up into the low branches overhead, and for one suspended second everything, the old laughter, the years of quiet, the whole complicated history that particular backyard held, felt whole again all at once. Tyler watched the light dance over his son's hand, then looked over at me across the yard. Guess we both finally found what we were looking for, he said. Respect? I asked. Peace, he said. Turns out it's not the same thing at all. The evening settled into that particular kind of quiet that isn't empty anymore. It had a shape to it now, earned one honest summer at a time. Not perfect. I noticed my mother later that night still telling a neighbor over the fence that I worked with the Navy doing something with helicopters, the same soft, imprecise phrasing she'd used for a decade. Some habits apparently too old to fully retrain even now. I let it go. I'd stopped needing her to get every word exactly right in order to believe I'd earned my place at that table. 19 years after that very first backyard, the one where Tyler raised a beer and called me the family's paper pilot in front of everyone I drove back to Jacksonville on leave. Down the same coastal road lined with pines bent sideways from decades of salt wind, the ocean flashing silver between the trees every quarter mile or so. The old Doyle house still stood, its paint sun-faded now, its porch turned into something like a small, unofficial gallery of a whole family's history. Photos of Frank in dress uniform from decades back, Tyler shaking hands with veterans outside the outreach center he now ran full-time, the one that had grown from a single volunteer shift into something with his name on the paperwork. Caleb at 18, grinning beside his father at some ceremony or another, taller than either of them now, and tucked between all of it, smaller than the rest, a frame holding a photo of me in my flight suit, sunlight glinting hard off my helmet, 4 handwritten words beneath it in Frank's blocky, deliberate handwriting. Specter. Family of the brave. Inside Caleb, tall now, calm in a way that still occasionally surprised me. All the wobbling toddler, long since replaced by something steadier, was carefully wiping dust off the glass case that held both challenge coins side by side. He turned when he heard the screen door creak, the late afternoon light catching his face. Aunt Alex, he said. Were you scared? That night, I mean, the real one. Yes, I said, coming to stand beside him at the case. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Caleb. It's flying anyway, with the fear sitting right there next to you in the cockpit the whole time. He smiled, something curious and quietly proud moving across his face at the same time. Dad says bravery runs in the Doyle blood. It doesn't run in blood, I told him. It runs in choice. Every single time. Fresh, whether you feel ready for it or not. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away somewhere permanent. The way you file things away at 18 when you're just starting to understand they'll matter later. There was this kid at school. Back when I was maybe 13, he said after a moment, leaning against the porch rail, told me girls couldn't really cut it in combat roles, that most of it was just paperwork and good PR photos. I didn't really know what to say back to him. Went home that afternoon and told Dad about it instead. What'd he say? He told me the whole thing. Not the short version he used to tell at barbecues. The real one, all of it, including the part about the extraction point being his mistake in the first place. Said if I ever heard anyone talk like that kid did again, I should ask myself if it sounded like paperwork to me. The part where you flew through weather that grounded 2 Blackhawks the same night just to bring him home to raise me. Caleb shrugged, a little embarrassed, a little proud all at once. Shut the kid right up. He never brought it up again. I felt something warm settle behind my ribs, hearing that story secondhand, filtered through 18 years, and a boy who'd grown into a young man carrying it forward without me having to ask him to. Not vindication, exactly. Something quieter and better than that. Tyler pulled into the driveway not long after, still in his work clothes, a lanyard from the outreach center still around his neck. He'd driven straight from a group session, he said, dropping his keys on the porch table with the particular tiredness of a man who's spent his days sitting across from people who'd seen things they couldn't fully put into words either. Had a new guy today, he said, settling into the chair beside his father. 24, back 8 months, hasn't said more than 10 words to anybody the whole time. Today, he finally talked. Took him 8 months to get there. He shook his head slowly. I used to think silence like that just meant somebody didn't have anything to say. Took me 31 years and my own family to learn it usually means the exact opposite. You're good at that work, I told him, and meant it. Learned from a pretty specific teacher, he said, glancing at me then at his father. Wasn't cheap tuition either of you? Frank huffed out something between a laugh and a cough. Cheapest thing I ever taught you, actually. Just took me the longest to hand it over. The screen door creaked open behind us. Frank stepped out slowly, a cane in one hand now, but still carrying that particular quiet command in his voice that 30 years of service never quite lets a man fully set down. You made this whole family finally understand what service actually means, he said, easing himself into his porch chair with a small groan he didn't bother hiding anymore. Ugh, took you longer than it should have to get us all there, but you did it. Took a few barbecues, I said. He chuckled, the sound settling into the low hum of cicadas working through the last of the evening heat. Overhead, the unmistakable rhythm of rotor blades cut through the quiet. A formation of MH-60 Seahawks out of NAS Jacksonville running a training pattern low along the coastline, close enough that the setting sun caught their windows and threw quick flashes of light down onto the porch below. One of those flashes landed square on the coin case in Caleb's hands, and for a heartbeat the whole porch seemed to glow gold with it. I looked at the boy, then at the man beside him, who used to be my commanding officer's own commander, my uncle, and for a long, complicated stretch of years, my most difficult silence to break. The ones who matter already know, I said quietly. The rest will catch up eventually, on their own time. And if they don't, that's on them, Caleb. Not on you, and not on me either. The Seahawks banked out over the water and disappeared into the deepening blue. Frank eased back further into his chair, eyes half closed, listening to the fading rotor wash the way some men listen to old songs they've stopped needing to explain to anyone. Caleb stood up a little straighter without quite seeming to notice he was doing it, the coin case held carefully in both hands, catching the last of the light. Tyler came out onto the porch with 4 glasses of lemonade balanced awkwardly against his chest, passing them around without ceremony, and for a while nobody said much of anything at all. The cicadas kept working through the last of the daylight. Somewhere down the block, a screen door banged, a dog barked twice and gave up ordinary evening sounds, folding in around 4 generations of the same complicated imperfect, finely honest family sitting together on the same porch that used to hold a very different kind of silence. I thought about the girl I'd been at that first backyard barbecue, gripping a beer can so hard the metal bent under my fingers, certain nobody would ever really see her. She hadn't been wrong to feel invisible. She'd just been wrong about how long it would stay that way, and about whose job it was, in the end, to fix it. Mine, mostly. Nobody had handed me the truth. I'd had to go get it. One overlooked conversation and one honest confession at a time, and hand pieces of it back to the people who loved me badly before they learned to love me well. Honor. I'd learned. Slowly the hard way across 19 summers of the same backyard, never really lived in the medals or the salutes, or even in the overdue apologies. Necessary as every single one of them had turned out to be. It lived in the quiet understanding that came after all of it was finally said out loud, that the sky doesn't ask who you are before it lets you fly through it. It only ever asks whether you're willing to go.